Hello everyone, welcome to our Comments and Answers TJ channel. I hope all of you are doing well. In this video, we will prepare for the book study, Enjoy Life. This week, we will study Chapter 6, covering chapters 9 to 17. So, let's get started. Let's move on to the next subtitle. He gave a very courageous testimony about the God of Glory. Questions 9 and 10. Why have some scholars criticized Stephen's speech before the Sanhedrin, and what should we keep in mind? Some critics argue that the speech is too long and detailed, deviating from Stephen's immediate purpose of defending himself against the accusations. They believe this extensive approach may have distracted the audience from the central message Stephen was trying to convey. We should keep in mind that Stephen's speech aimed not only to prove his innocence against the immediate accusations but also to provide a historical context for his Christian beliefs. His focus on Israel's history was not a distraction but a strategy to illustrate the continuity and fulfillment of God's redemptive work throughout history. Questions 11 and 12, Part A. How did Stephen use the case of Abraham? Stephen used Abraham's case to question the idea that serving Jehovah was conditioned by the presence of a physical temple. He emphasized that Jehovah appeared to Abraham while he still lived in Mesopotamia, long before the Jerusalem temple existed or before the law of Moses was given. This approach suggested that the relationship with God was not limited to practices associated with the temple or the observance of the law of Moses. Instead, it highlighted that Abraham's relationship with God was based on faith and how he lived his life, even before a temple or established law existed. By emphasizing this point, Stephen implied that accusations of blasphemy against God and Moses were unfounded. They suggested that the relationship with God was more about how one lived their life than constructing a building like the temple or observing specific religious rituals. This approach challenged the common perception of the temple and the law's importance in worship and service to God, supporting his defense before the Sanhedrin. Questions 11 and 12, Part B. Why was it significant that Stephen included Joseph in his speech? Joseph was a highly respected and well-known figure to everyone present in the Sanhedrin. By including Joseph in his speech, Stephen captured the audience's attention and established another point of connection with their cultural and religious context. Stephen knew that there were clear similarities between Joseph and Jesus Christ in terms of their unjust suffering, rejection by their own brothers, and subsequent exaltation to save their people. Instead of explicitly mentioning this parallel, Stephen chose to present Joseph's story in a way that allowed the audience to make their own connections with the figure of Jesus Christ. Question 13. Why did Stephen's example of Moses help him demonstrate that the accusations were false, and what truth did he make very clear? Stephen, by extensively speaking about Moses, showed deep respect for this historical leader and the law he had delivered. This was significant because Sanhedrin members, especially the Sadducees, held great reverence for Moses' writings. By showing respect for Moses, Stephen refuted accusations of blasphemy against him and demonstrated they were false. Stephen also emphasized that Moses, despite being chosen by God to lead the people of Israel, was rejected and challenged repeatedly by his own people. This point was relevant to Stephen because he, too, was being rejected by Jewish leaders despite proclaiming the message of salvation given by God. Stephen revealed a significant truth by highlighting Moses' rejection and pointing out that it was a recurring pattern in the history of God's people. This historical pattern helped contextualize the rejection Stephen himself was facing at that moment, providing a broader perspective on the situation. Question 14. What did Stephen highlight based on Moses' example? Stephen used Moses' prediction about a prophet like him, mentioned in Acts 7 verse 37, to highlight that Jesus Christ's rejection by the Jewish people was similar to the rejection Moses faced in his time. By making this comparison, Stephen suggested that Jesus Christ was a prophet sent by God similarly to Moses, and his rejection by the Jewish people was unjustified and comparable to Moses' rejection. Stephen also highlighted that Moses learned that any ground could become holy, such as when Jehovah spoke from the burning bush, and the ground became holy. This raised questions about whether Jehovah desired to be worshipped only in a specific place, like the Jerusalem temple. This point challenged the common belief that the temple was the only legitimate place to worship God and suggested a broader understanding of holiness and worship. Questions 15 and 16, Part A. How did Stephen use the example of the tabernacle to support his arguments? Stephen reminded the tribunal that Moses had worshipped Jehovah in the tabernacle. This reference showed that Moses, a highly revered leader in Jewish tradition, had recognized and accepted the tabernacle as the proper place to worship God. By doing so, Stephen suggested that the tabernacle had an equally significant importance and validity as the later temple in Jerusalem. Questions 15 and 16, Part B. How did Stephen use Solomon's temple in his explanation? Stephen mentioned that Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem and paraphrased the inspired words Solomon spoke in prayer, found in 2 Chronicles 6 verse 18. These words emphasize that, "the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands," suggesting that God transcends any physical structure and is not confined to a specific place like the temple. Stephen argued that, while Jehovah could use a temple to fulfill his purposes, he did not need one to achieve them. This statement challenged the common belief that God's presence and favor were exclusively associated with the presence in the Jerusalem temple. Stephen highlighted that, despite their devotion to the temple and traditions, his accusers did not pay attention to the most important thing, the reason Jehovah had given them the law and the temple. This observation highlighted his accusers' lack of spiritual understanding and their misguided focus on external practices rather than the true essence of worship and the relationship with God. Question 17, Part A. How did Stephen expose the attitudes of his accusers? Stephen pointed out that Sanhedrin members had become too attached to the temple and human traditions they had added to the law. This revealed an attitude of overvaluing physical structures and human religious practices over focusing on God's original purpose in giving the law and the temple. Question 17, Part B. How did he prove with his speech that he was innocent? Stephen demonstrated his innocence with his speech by focusing on the central point of the matter, obedience to Jehovah as the best way to honor the law and the temple. Through his speech, Stephen showed that his commitment was to obey God above any tradition or religious structure. By demonstrating that his primary focus was to obey Jehovah and fulfill his will, Stephen established his innocence against blasphemy accusations. His speech made it clear that he had done everything possible to obey God, refuting accusations against him. In summary, Stephen proved his innocence by showing that his commitment was to obey Jehovah above all, contrasting with his accusers' misplaced priorities. Well, those have been the practical answers regarding the Congregation Book Study for this week. I hope it is very helpful for you, my dear brothers and sisters. I send you a strong embrace, and may Jehovah bless and protect you always.